All right. So without further ado, with the motions of determinism versus free will, I call upon the Prime Minister to start the debate. Here.
Okay, am I clear enough?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. After a long year pandemic, we are still being questioned what have we gained with everything that we got from the time that we spent at home and from the working from home condition, for example, which we are still being questioned. Why aren't we become better and cope better with everything? Because we have to adapt with the condition after this whole year. But in their world, where people seem to have choices, where they also have lots of option in their hand, unknown or even quantifiable with unknown or even quantifiable consequences. People live life with the belief that they get to change their lives and their course of life on their own, because they believe that free will in its essence has brought lots of chances for them to be better. When in fact, in our side of the house, we believe that it also brought lots of suffering, as failure is romanticized as pathway to success. In our side of the house, we're living in a world where determinism means that we are able to realize fully that change needs to be pursued. Likewise, we are also embracing all the hardship entails with it. For example, that our economic capacity is also because it's inherited by our parents. So we are becoming like in the low economy or even in the upper class economy. It also because our parents or like the existence of climate change is the result of the environmental changes, and at the same time the accumulation of what people have done, rather than saying that this might probably happen because yeah, we live in this era, so it's the accumulation that happened before, not necessarily because we live in this world, so we are faced with this struggle and such. So at the end of the day, in opening government, we are going to show you how people actively believing in determinism will create a better circumstances in the individual level and go through the societal level. We believe that actively believing means that people are continuously reminding themselves and people around them that many things happen due to unknown reasons and background, or even if they do know, they are still saying that it's not entirely because of their fault or they have those capacity to change it in the first place. So to my first substantive, let's see the theory, and then we're going to talk about how it affects individuals and the societal level at the end of the day. So first, in the theory, principally, people are unable to disappear life and change it fully. Like you cannot just saying that I want to be success and then boom, you have got everything that you want, because it goes through a lot of process in their side of the house. Free will means that you will need to do a lot of things, because it's all in your hand that you can change your life to be better or not. While in our side of the house, we're going to acknowledge that it's our capacity. It's there are lots of reasons and variable that creates you into these circumstances. For example, that your family might affect you to be more neurotic because of genetic, for example, or you are also being exposed in a school or environment that is very racist, so you also become a quite racist person. And then lastly, there are also the circumstances of relevance or of nurturance and nature. So we believe that naturally we are inclined to be more heterosexual, for example, or homosexual. And then by the nurturance, we can also change, by the nurturance, it's also affected by lots of people, not necessarily ourselves being able to change it based on what we want in that in the end of the day. So having this inability to comprehend change, to comprehend everything, means that our physical, mental, and spiritual capacity may be overwhelmed and therefore result in a bad circumstances. However, we also believe that individual will better cope with life under the determinism in theory. Why this matter? Because what we want as human being is to ensure our quality of life. And to get that better quality of life, the very important variable is to get to be able to be happy and have a satisfaction of your own life. And how to start having all this happiness is that you are able to control what is in your hand, your time, your resources, your future plan. But all those kinds of things can also change in a day, and without you knowing what happened and what might cause that to happen. Before I move,
Don't you think that in your cyber house, people will be able to incline to blame on the externalities instead of trying to make a better version of themselves?
We think that externalities is something that people can understand why it might happen. Why so? Because you know that it's out of your control. For example, it's out of your control to be born in a family that's not happy. For example, it's out of your control to be born in the village instead of in the big city to pursue better education. For example, it's all out of your control, and it's not something that people will just blame it on other people, but they will accept that. And to get that acceptance is to understand that all of this is out of control, and the only thing that I can do is to accept what is in my hand, and what can I do with everything that I have. So under their side of the house, believing that they have free will means that they have power or to change everything. However, they also have the mindset that everything is, I am responsible for everything, and I have to challenge myself in order to get a better circumstances. However, what we will get is that we're going to be more bitter and upset of everything that we might not be able to change. For example, you might think that you can control your time currently, but you also have lots of work, for example, and stresses due to the work that is placed upon you, for example. So you are unable to change everything. But in our side of the house, we believe that the effect like physical illnesses that will resulted from mental stresses or loss can also affect your relationship, for example. And because all of that, the only way that we can help ourselves is to accept things, and the way we accept that is by realizing that everything that these things is not in our capacity to change it. So in the societal level, what will happen is that we will get a more happy individual, and at the same time creating happy community that will not stress over plans and dreams, but living in the present and accept their life for what is given to them, and just use that existing resources for their own betterment. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you so much, BM. Next, LO.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, give me a few seconds to set up my timer. If you want to POI, just unmute yourself because I won't be looking at the Zoom all. I'm using my phone, so yeah. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I feel like the entire case of the government side of the house or opening government really just, I want to be happy. I want to have a better quality of life because I feel overwhelmed with how people cannot control things in their lives, right? We think that just because you believe in free will, it doesn't necessarily mean negate the fact that there are things that is out of your control. For example, when you get cancer, there's no way you could actually be able to, for example, genetically run away from it. That's something that's going to be happening at the end of the day. People will not beat themselves up for that. What people will beat themselves up for example, is the idea of how their family is killed by this particular person, and then the person comes up to the court and said, oh, well, it's determinism. I believe in the idea that the reason I become such a horrendous serial killer is because of my uncle once did something to me, or my entire life is just basically a result of like killing and basically people doing bad stuff to me. And then just pushing that particular person entire moral responsibility aside just for the sake of, we want to live comfortably where I don't have to feel that I am in agency or my responsibility lies on my individuality, and that's something we don't believe in. We believe on the idea that we should have three particular things in this debate. The first one is how this philosophy is bad. The second one on the idea whether the individual or the societal benefit exists. And then lastly, on why this heading, I assume it's philosophy is going to be worse on the other side. Let's just go, because basically most of my rebuttals is interconnected arguments. I'm going to continue anyway. Number one, let's talk about how determinism is bad and free will is good. We think that the idea is simple. Determinism is a dangerous understanding. It's a dangerous ideology because it basically relies on two things. How, in the end of the day, you either have what Feliani explains, behavioral and genetical determinism, or number two, godly determinism, on the idea that people believe that something happened because of higher power and stuff like that. We think that that's two points of basically problematic philosophy or ideology that we should believe in. Why? Because number one, people are either going to basically push aside the actual decisions that they made to do something, for example, beat their wives, for example, or basically do crimes or do bad things to each other. On the case of you know what, I have a lot of things in my mind. I have a lot of things that is building up from my childhood, blah, 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 blah. People will most likely use this as a way to basically push aside the idea of responsibility that they all have. This is bad for our lifestyle because basically people are now free to basically say whatever they want and go away on the idea of oh yeah, determinism existed. At least in our side, it will be better because at the very least, we don't necessarily push people to believe in anything. Simply believe that it's the same as the actual idea that there is no truth, whether determinism exists or free will exists in general. Right? This is the world we are living in. What we want instead is something that if you want to believe in determinism, go ahead. If you want to believe in free will, you go ahead as well. But even if not, we will still stand for free will and why free will is good anyway. First, let's talk about how in the end of the day, the idea of having an agency and your own choices is better on our side. At the very least, we have the capacity to basically have our own possibility to change anything in our lives. Meaning that whatever we choose will be the one that we end up with, whether the consequences is good or bad, we end up with. Meaning that we will also be able to feel less overwhelmed because at the very least, we know how it ends in a particular way, right? For example, if you actually try to do your best and, for example, not succeed because like that song. We think that the idea is that simply speaking, you will actually try to find your actual problems or something that you missed in order for you to basically self-actualize. You try to better yourself because you look inside and see that there is the problem is from here and it's not there. Problem is here and it's not that. Instead of simply, for example, if you're going to apply for a scholarship, it's because the scholarship people are just determined to have a certain amount of biases, which doesn't, accept my particular identity. I think that's the problem here. It's not me, it's them. I think this is the ideology that's going to be problematic in the end of the day. Right? When you have free will, you have the capacity to actually choose a lot of things. You can make jokes about how free will is the Free Willy movie, for example, like what Dio did, even though it's not necessarily that funny. But my point is that the idea is free will and the goodness of the people actually exists hand in hand. It is an intuitive idea, which is my second point of argument. In the idea of why this is going to be beneficial for individuals and society, right? We're talking about the idea that if everyone believes in free will, actively believes in free will, people are more likely to actually have a certain amount of moral responsibility, right? That's how basically any states and general philosophy is created. It is the moral responsibility for humanity to not do bad things, even if we can choose to do so, right? That's the idea of free will in the end of the day. We're actually making sure that you are able to understand your own morality and fight that particular urge to not do bad things, regardless of your background, stuff like that. That's how it is seen anywhere. We think that that's the idea that we need to understand. Individuals will benefit because at the very least, people will actually feel safer in their particular societies because they know that people will not blame other things for the cases that they are going to push that. They're not going to blame externalities for things that they did, for example. We think that at the very least, courts would also feel like there is actual benefit, or actual weighing on what people did, not what caused them to do something. Even if, let's say, in our case, in the world, there are cases in which people are going to have to see the backgrounds, but in the end of the day, the crime is still judged for what they did and not because of what they experienced in the past. If that's the particular case, we don't think that's how justice and things will be upheld. Thus, a society that is most likely going to be dystopian on the idea of what they believe in is the most important thing, and not necessarily what they did is going to be bad. Lastly, on the philosophy and why this heading, and it's actually good. It's actually a good thing to portion. We think on the idea of why this is a philosophical motion. Because in the end of the day, determinism and free will is something that has been a great debate for so far. And the only reason for that is the idea that we, as human beings, should strive to be better always, which is why philosophy always asks those particular questions, why people should live, and what is the goal of our particular life. The idea is to better yourself. This is what we're trying to push in the end of the day. We champion in this particular idea because by pushing for free will, we try to better ourselves every single day. We're actually making the right choices and taking up that particular moral responsibility that we have. Right? Comparatively to the side, I'm okay because there is things out of my control, and I'm just gonna chill, bro. And like one day it's gonna come to me like some kind of anime in which I will eat someone's hair and I'll become like this gigantic hero can help everyone out. But that's not going to be the case then. What's most likely going to be more likely to happen is you fighting for the particular position. If you're fighting for your own life, basically that's how you're going to achieve self-actualization. That's how you'll have better quality of life and not feel overwhelmed every single time something bad happened to you. And that's called being an adult, I guess. Talking from the man child. Thank you very much. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, LO. Next, DPM.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that opening opposition are so desperate to be a better version of themselves that they forget that they need to take a rest, or even they didn't need to be a giant. It's just an illusion that they've created because they want to be a better version, probably by going gigantic or become a titan at the end of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, understand that what we mean in determinism that have been distort the definition by the opening opposition are actually previously existing causes. So it's not like we just let everything happen and let it all be God's will and so on. No, we are learning from something that have happening before. We have doing the study cases. We have the proof. We are learning from our past and learning about morality, choices, options based on the things that have happened before, and we can use it as a scientific data rather than when on your own free will. It is a free will that are not validated or are even coming from your own self. Even probably in extreme cases where that free will can create a distortion in a human, where they think that they are Titan or they are a serial killer or they believe that they are Joker, for example. It can happening if free will are existing, and that's what currently create a distortion in our current society or our current status quo, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we prefer a world where determinism is the main key. We will win this debate if we are able to describe or even to portray to you how our society or our communities live in the ancient times, where there is no such the terms of free will, where all of the community are believing on existence or are believing on the experience that they have gone through or the existing causes that make them do that choices or have that kind of belief from the very first place, like how the tribal or how the ancient community can work hand in hand. Even they are one with the nature without creating any environment crisis or without killing one and another, for example, or even they are willing to share things voluntarily. While in our current status quo, all of people will share something to you if there is benefit or threat of, for example, because we are living in a current capitalistic world where it is mostly being affected by the free will from the very first place, ladies and gentlemen. So what Feli have already explained to you, how actually opening opposition are trying to level up themselves, trying to have free will, trying to have the competition, endless competition and mindless competition, which all people are agreeing to, that they are enslaved by the terms of free will. And I don't think that this is a free will anymore, because now every person will try to push their self or overwork their self to the point probably they will suffer or they will struggle until they forget the limit of their own self and harm them at the end of the day. The quality of the life, the happiness level that they will get won't be accepted because because at the end of the day, they will always struggle and think to be better, and never ending becoming a better version of themselves. This is the things that we want to avoid. We don't want to live in this kind of world, and that is our current status quo right now, where all people are so tired, because even when pandemic happens, all people said that you need to you have your own free will, you need to do better things, you can be a better version of yourself by doing so on and so forth that is productive. But actually you also have the option to take a rest, or to give back to your community, or even cope with your community and help one another, like how the tribal, like how the Dayaknis community help one another and become one with the nature from the very first place. This is the community that we want. This is the individual level where we didn't need to think or to plan so hard, but we need to be one with one another, understanding one another, and no judgmental that is so extreme. Yes, judgmental or even some social standard will still exist, but at least the social standard will be the guidance for all of the people, at least the basic human decency plus several study cases or several experiences that have been used as the part of the determinism or the belief itself will be imparted towards the society, and they will live along. While in your case, in the free will, now everybody have their own free will. We cannot even determine the option that they have. There is too much option, too wide perception, and that creates a distortion, where because of this kind of distortion and a lot of differences does exist, conflict does happen, and this is what creates more conflicts in our current world, in our current society. While in the world of determinism, that kind of option will be narrowed, because we now have the same, or we have the basic or the guidance through this theory, through this experience that we have gone through together. For example, this is the things that will create a better society and a better individual, where they will understand more about themselves, where they will be more accepting about themselves, improving more of the quality of life in the terms of happiness, rather than only improving their own self or their own interests. At the end of the day, that's what opening opposition are trying to say from the very beginning. That's why we say that this is the better situation, a better world where we would live just like how our ancestors have been living with one another, even with the nature itself, helping hand in hand one another and having a peaceful society. Yes, indeed, there are several wars because of several conflicts, but this is because of the free will itself, where there are different perception, where there are different opinion and one another that clashes and created conflicts, which happen because of free will existing from the very first place. But while if all of the people in our world are actively going into determinism, at least this will be minimalized at the end of the day. So we won't be stressed over by the free will or by the society standard, where we need to grow better each of the day. Every day we need to grow better, to be a better person, or to be a better debater at the end of the day. No, we won't live in that society, but at least we will live in a society where we will cope or have this mechanism where we will hand in hand work together to be able to accept or to have the same belief, and we won't blame one another at the end of the day. This is the kind of mechanism where the word of determinism will be more idealistic and will be more peaceful, or even have a better quality of life than the quality of life that the opening opposition wants, that they always want to level up, but they forget about their own individual or even societal happiness only for their own interests that have been started by the society. So I don't really think this is a free will. Therefore, we are proudly proposing this motion under the idea that the quality of happiness will be more reachable under our status quo, under our mechanism, rather than their mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you, DPM. Next, DLO.
Hi, if there's any POI, just unmute yourself, but please don't parachute a lot of POI. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In a world where everything was arbitrary, what makes a life worth living? What makes a life worth living is the ability for you to determine the course of your life, the agency over your own body and life, knowing that you are in fact full in control over your life. And this is what opening opposition stands for. Very proud to propose. But one thing that I need to highlight is that most of the opening government cases does not even engage with what my leader of opposition told you, right? Most of the principle that my leader of opposition told you still remains. If I'm able to prove to you why agency does not exist in their certain house and why agency should be the most important matrix, I do think that the positive material of the opening opposition should be credited very highly, right? But let's understand what we agree with government. Look, we agree with government that the world is extremely unfair and arbitrary. However, we think that this debate should mainly revolve around the premise which methods are going to provide better individual responses towards this arbitrary condition. Government pretty much mentioned that as long as the people are feeling complacent and think that they are quite happy with their current self, despite that they do not have the capacity to make changes, to change their current status quo, then this is the life that they envision, right? This is what the opposition are going to argue upon, that I do not think that it is actually a standard standard living condition for a human being, a standard living mental state for the human being, right? 3 engagement towards them. Number 1, the world that OG envision is telling people that you should go down towards the injustice and unfairness that the world has thrown upon you. Note panel, we concede that even in the world of opposition, we cannot guarantee that people will definitely be able to make changes. Sure, maybe this will end up result in you being disappointed, or sure, maybe in the best case, you can make changes, right? But the most important thing in this debate is not at which side are going to be more likely to create changes. In both sides, it's going to be uncertain. However, the most important thing then, which sides are more likely to trigger the passion of the people to remain changes in the status quo? This is exactly what my leader of opposition told you, right? Number 1, because you have the mere capability that you can actually change us, that everything around you is within your grasp and control, something that you can actually change us. But second of all, the most important thing is that they understand that the self-evolutions will even be better in your certain house, right? Exactly, because now you realize that in the past, there's a lot of people that conduct atrocities. We do not want to make this happen yet again, and we have the capacity to ensure that this will not happen, right? At best, they told you that you would still be able to learn from the past, but they never explained to you why in their certain house, those people in their certain house actually possess the incentive to do so. I do not actually think that you can actually credit their contribution, right? Second response says, you cannot simply buy into OG arguments that told you that in our side, you're going to feel overwhelmed and you will find more contentment in their certain house, right? Number 1, I do not necessarily understand how these people are going to be simply feeling overwhelmed when in constant method, we are going to feel overwhelmed, especially because we are going to think what's currently happening in our side of the house, right? So overwhelmed are going to happen in both sides of the house. But what is the comparative in their side of the house? In their side of the house, people are still going to stress because if they are born poor, they do not have the capacity to do so. And in fact, they are going to blame those externalities that exist. In a sense, you're going to blame on the God that puts you on this kind of condition that is severely harmful, right? If you, for example, are a victim of a certain criminal activities, rape, murder, and so on and so forth, you're still going to blame the God. And especially because this is something that the God has designed to you. This God that this is the things that the God actually desires you to actually feel, right? You're not going to think that the world is fair. You're not going to even think that the God is kind, right? Look, in their house, you're going to deprive the people of the sense of comfortability and the sense of relatability with the things of so-called religion. We do not think that it is actually very fair in their house, right? But so last responses, they told you that this will create too much options in their sort of house and this creates confusion, right? Number 1, I do think that sure, maybe confusions are going to happen in your sort of house, but they never told you any comparative. We argue that confusions in their sort of house are going to be far significantly far harmful, especially because the confusions that you're going to think exactly at the scale of the universe, in which some things are going to be changed even without your control, even something that is going to change even without something that you can actually comprehend. The mystery of the universe, for example, right? I do not think that you should actually credit them as well. Now, I'm going to bring you pretty much an extensions, but pretty much I'm going to tell you the comparative why pretty much agency does not exist in their house. But let's understand first, what is agency? Agency means that you're in control over your own life. In order for a human being to feel agency, they must realize that they have the capacity to influence over their own surrounding. This is why we consider the ability to determine your identity as a queer, for example, as a means for you to exercise your own agency. We argue that agency would never exist in the world of government because the people within their world would never imagine that they had actually the capacity to influence their life. Because in the world of government, people are constrained within the flow of faiths. that everything was meant to be, and I'm merely a speckle of dust within the grand scheme of the world. You do not think that you can actually influence any changes because the flow of fates are that strong. It is beyond the control of any human. It is the works of ethereal being beyond our mind, right? That even, for example, if I exert my utmost capability, if it's not destined to happen, then it's not going to happen, right? We argue that this results in you being deprived of your own agency, because you're going to simply go with your life and people will simply feel complacent about their own condition. Because happiness or sadness will naturally occur to me, changes and the betterment for the world will naturally occur to me, even without me needing to exercise any efforts in it, without me needing to actually demand changes, right? Their world is cruel because they make people think that they does not possess any capacity to actually create changes. Changes can only happen when it was decided by those ethereal beings in their house that this is not something that is within the people controls. What happens in a world of opposition? Number one, we allow the people to actualize themselves in a sense that because the mere sense that you have the capacity to actually influence changes, that you have the mere capacity to actually determine the course of your life, this makes you feel the sense of liberating in a sense that everything that was arbitrary now was within your control, and you to some certain degree have control over what is arbitrary in the world, right? But second, this also creates a better self-evaluation because you cannot blame, sure, maybe you can blame externalities, but you're not going to blame those externalities that you seem that is simply that in the grand schemes of the world, right? You're going to blame the people for the actions that they did, in a sense that these people harm me because they have the free intention and they need to be punished for this, and I deserve to be punished. I deserve to get reparation for that, right? Why this should be the most important thing in this debate? Number one, look, in the world of government, the harm towards the agency of the people is irreversible because the sense of control over their life was missing. You cannot grant in this in their house because the prerequisite for people to have this sense of agency is for them to have the capacity to think that they are able to make and to create changes. But second, we argue that because what makes a human is their agency. This is what differentiates us with monkey, for example. Because even if, for example, monkey are smart enough, they do not have the capacity to actually determine their self-identity. They cannot actually actualize themselves in the world. We argue that this is what makes a human very important.
Thank you so much, Dia. Before we go to the closing bands, can I have like several minutes to take water, like downstairs, like 2 minutes?
Sure.
Okay. Hi, I'm back. So sorry for the delay. Yeah, call upon MD.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
If you want to POI me, please use the chat box, or you can unmute yourself during the minute of 5 minutes or so. Let me set my timer first. Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, When closing government basically believe in a world where every individual and also society are able to realize that something about there's an external power that can exist within our own self, right? This look like into the ability for people to reflect on morality as their basis behavior on determinism. But second of all, this also prove on the dynamic of society why would be better. Like there are twofold of this, right? Number one, how individual would reflect on their condition and make decisions. Second of all, how society make form of evaluation on problem or issue that exists in our current status quo. Why is this is an important framework? Three things on this. Number one, this is the missing identification from both opening debate, because both opening debate directly claims that in the world determinism and free will, people would not likely to make a better assessment due to the fact that in opposition side of the house, people would not likely have the agency to want to demand changes, right? What is this is a problematic identification of free will in the very first place, because this is a one-sided perspective. There is no clarification from opening opposition how people would give changes just because that they believe so, right? Because you can ask for changes as much as you want, but the society can deny that changes as well by enforcing on your choices as being wrong in that particular regard. Because we are still in live in the contextualization of people that exist within a predetermined condition. We still live in a society with existing patriarchal culture or existing capitalist culture. We don't see any kind of likelihood as to why is it that people can manifest their free will just because they believe so in opposition side of the house, which is why agency important only on OO, because everyone have the agency to emphasize their selfish choices and power as well. This is why it's important for another individual to have this particular agency. Things they can they things that they can change and change because they have free will. It doesn't exist in our side of the house, right? Because the description of the world that also missing from opening government is several things. Number one, within that, what missing the most is identification how people are going to reflect on morality, right? In our side of the house, people are going to reflect morality on the basis of externality as opposed to individual power and capacity. This look like into determinism, believing in external condition like decision of other people, decision of a more exterior and spiritual being, or existence of a more different concept that are powerful as you, like for example, the existence of government and capitalists. But which is in free will, you will more likely analyze on individual capacity more. In OO analysis, on the ability for you to blame other existence or choices are very inconsistent, because at some point they considered that you would likely to blame externality more on our side of the house. Therefore, it is unclear as to why is it likely that you would likely to, for example, identify externality as being the problem rather than your individual choices, right? That is to say that comparing the likelihood of this, within it is more likely people to acknowledge external condition than their own first on our side of the house, right? Just clarification as well, we don't think that this debate should operate on the idea of crime. We think that crime will not be excused because assessment of law still exists as social order. We can measure it on the value of harm as well. We don't think that it is particularly important contribution or harm that are exclusive just because you believe in that particular assessment of the debate. It's true that you need to be able to assess the correlability of this moral concept into the idea and how it influences individual behavior. But second of all, within that, you need to be able to assess this debate on the ability for the world to be able to measure on how then people are going to be able to accept a certain condition better. But second of all, the measurement and comparative of the consequences, why will be better off to be catered in our side of the house or theirs. So I'm going to talk about one thing. So how the different shape of the world would look like and how this influence individual and communal level. So we think that free will exists in several conditions, because opening opposition also never describe how the world are going to be look like, right? Within the free will exists in a world of assessment where individual assessment are more internal. This means that there are much more contextualization that we are going to more likely assess our individual capacity and our individual problem in which our decision are created, right? Contextualizing that we live in a world where predetermined condition does exist. What it is harmful to live in a world of opposition? Several things. A, within the whole contribution that claims that people need to be able to make active changes are within the inability for them to be able to realize that not everyone can make changes or even can take these particular changes in the very first place. Because even though the changes can or may not be manifested within it, it doesn't exist just because that you believe in that particular condition, right? The manifestation of changes only can be beneficial when you have the act of privilege, which is you believe are accompanied by the ability for you to make these changes: capital, mental condition, social support, accessibility. This is why that particular regard in world of opposition, there going to be a shape of illusion of how people think that they could be able to make an out from that particular condition because of their solo individual capacity, right? This is why determinism is better, because it doesn't require you to have any kind of external concept of privilege in order to operate this belief, right? Determinism is an act of accepting, which is everyone can have and learn in some point of their life. It exists within the ability for you to blame and put reasoning on why something exists in your life, which is why words of people blaming other people or like concept, we think that is totally okay for as long as you can find comfort of that, especially contextualizing it in a point of, for example, you come from a minority where you will not likely to have capacity to change your condition as well. Within that, the sense of blaming other people and the sense of not blaming your own self is something that you need, because at worst, when people are poor and not trying to be richer, we're fine for it, at least that they can find sense of comfort of their condition, because suffering is a result from social pressure and inability to break free from guilt of your own condition. The example of this is sexual minority that blame themselves because of their sexuality, right? Because there's a narrative that I am who I am because God decides so on our side of the house, or poor society that can blame it on government, or rich society, right? Whether this is a better condition of society as well, because it impacts communal perspective in our side of the house, right? Because on communal level, we think that there would be much more better acknowledgement of systems that are problematic rather than in opposition. Because in opposition, the acknowledgement more likely are going to within individual power, right? Number one, this de-emphasize the ability for people to cooperate to make their life better, because there's a centricism of self-capacity and denying the incapability or predetermined condition that causes suffering. The example of this is the conceptualization on how structural poverty created and because of the poor, blaming on the poor decision for not being good enough, or they believe that the poor have the individual agency to make changes on their own, but they choose to not make this agency to manifest that. Why this is important? Because it identifies the flexibility on opposition as bad. Because how you define individual power and capacity of choice is also very different from one way or another. Because little agency become reason to not do anything because they are not as incapable yet. It means that people less likely to help on opposition as well, because they always can blame it in the ability that they still have this and they still have that. Therefore, there is no need for us to do so because they still can make choices. We think that this is harmful. Notice, just because we debate on the belief doesn't mean the capacity absolutely exists, right? Because we still live in a world with highly influenced by external value. This is why the contribution of CG is better, because we can prove to you how determinism affects society better, because it identifies the better evaluation on who is wrong. People can be more open to see other variable that causes a certain issue because they identify and focus more on the concept or structure instead on individual, right? The comparative of this is that people, instead of just blaming a certain individual like women for getting raped, people more likely to blame a certain access and culture that influence the entire belief of how people getting raped. Within it, it's a better identification of patriarchal culture that is toxical. It means that now outside of the house, you can eliminate people's ability to push their selfish beliefs, because people now understand that such externality exists, and they understand better when there is a condition that they could not accept in status quo and could not be controlled by a certain factor of individual power or individual belief. This is where the framework of closing government work better, because it clashes directly with opening opposition claim, which world is unfair and people would be able to make a better responses toward their condition. But we also evaluate better on the detail how people would likely to react and what also missing from opening government side of the house. More than proud to propose.
Thank you, MG. Next, MO.
Hello, everyone can hear me, yeah?
Yes.
Good. POI through the chat, please, or you can turn on your video and just raise your hand, and then I'll get to you, or do the raise hand function on Zoom. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 points of quick framing. Number one, why is opening debate out? Because any narrative is able to overwork yourself. Free will can make you feel as though your success is contingent on your efforts, thus you overwork yourself. Likewise, determinism can make you overwork yourself because everyone says the most correct life path is to become the corporate slave, for instance. This basically means incentive to do better to yourself is unimportant if not contingent on macro changes, which I'm going to extend on, which is why OO devastatingly loses in this debate when they said this debate isn't about changes. It definitely is about changes. Secondly, a bit of world building as to what actively believing in free will actually looks like, because I don't think any team actually talks about this, right? This is a bit different from the status quo on opposition, which has mixtures of determinism via like beliefs of Christianity, for instance, and free will via like liberalism, basically. So a world where people actively believe in free will means a world where everyone acts as an atomized individual. This takes out the entirety of the CG case because every single person actively believes that I am allowed to choose what I want to do. However, it does not mean that everyone blames themselves all the time. I can say I chose to steal that bread, but it was because of structural poverty that I did that. I have the choice to either starve or do a crime. I chose to do a crime. Likewise, I can say this other person did a bad thing to me primarily because they had free will to do that bad thing, and I can still call them out because they had that free will, and I have that free will to call them out as well. So this means that the call out mechanism that the CG want to talk about does not exist as a delta also. Thirdly, This is a prefers world debate, which means you cannot fiat that law systems, etc. exist. You must prove it actually exists and how it manifests. I'm going to show you how those things do not manifest on the government side. 3 issues. Firstly, social justice. Secondly, religion. And thirdly, individual benefit. Later. Firstly, social justice. Why is belief in free will required for social justice? 3 mechanisms. Firstly, because people never have a conception outside of currently existing moral paradigms. This is true because determinism flows to individual conceptions of alignment across time, that out of every probable outcome, we are at this particular point in time. So I flip all this stuff about homosexuals in opening government. They're likely to internalize that condition because they were supposed to suffer in that particular condition. Determinism, once again, is a religious concept that says that your current condition is a condition that you had to go through. And for that reason, I don't think people can opt out of it just by a conception of determinism. Secondly, free will is required to question moral paradigms on our side of the house, which is why it is better. My sense perceptions and understanding of truth and the incorrectness of certain social institutions rising can only be accessed when you believe you had free will and other people had free will to do that evil as well. This makes it the only way to call out social institutions like racism, for instance. Even with the weight of nationalism as well, people can still say the moral paradigms of the US suck because I believe it was the fault of bad precedents and installation of white frames of living, basically. So the concept of free will actually allows you and maximizes your ability to call out those institutions, while the concept of moral determinism means that you cannot actually call them out because you were supposed to be in that current point in time. Thirdly, and this is really important, yeah, I'm going to weigh up OO's justice claim that receives like zero explanation from their side of the house. The harm on prop is this: there is zero justice that is ever imposed. This is true because of 3 reasons, and this is also bad for 3 reasons. Number 1, because you achieve zero catharsis for victims. Every rape victim, every mass genocide is justified by the determinism of some random power, basically. But secondly, you have no justification to imprison someone on prop because I genuinely believe that law systems don't exist, as no one caused that suffering, or there was no intent to cause that suffering. So it was determined by externalities, and for that reason, you cannot pinpoint it towards a singular individual. But thirdly, even if you can't imprison people, for instance, we think this makes an unjust world in which your arbitration of criminals versus non-criminals is probably contingent on arbitrary factors like the harm you've inflicted on people and not at all on intent. So what this means is that proposition is unable to actually call out certain individuals or certain institutions that are actually bad. And if you do call out those institutions, it is going to be unfair. And for that reason, it becomes a worse world. Please note all this down because this is really important. But secondly, also, why is a world without religion preferable? 2 reasons. Firstly, because religion flows from a determinist conception that mankind is inherently evil or full of sin, for instance, that suffering is necessary, for instance. While this could be beneficial to make people morally good, it incurs significant harms of unchecked impositions, i.e. the Crusades, for instance, and justified oppression that goes significantly against our inherent feelings of empathy. I've illustrated this previously as well. But secondly, why is the alternative of free will more preferable to set moral standards? 2 reasons. Firstly, because the only way to access human rights. Actively believing each individual has free will means every individual's contribution is important. For that reason, you had to protect each individual in that regard. But secondly, religion is also a zero-sum game because I will either stay in that religion and believe all my suffering is appropriately imposed because of determinism, or I will leave and incur eternal suffering in hell. This is worse for individuals in every regard for their side of the house. And as long as I prove to you that religion is a determinist concept, at the point at which people believe it is actively believe in it, for instance, it is less preferable to live in that world in contrast to a world in which you believe that free will was the metric of action for each individual. Note this is actively believing in it, which basically means their side of the house has to actively explain actively believing in any kind of determinist conception, which can manifest in religion as well. Finally, why individual benefit is contingent on tapping into desire. The reason why I am talking about this in the third one is because I think OO kind of does a little bit here. I'm actually going to extend on the actual important stuff. What is the important stuff? Individuals need to have the agency to complement every other social pressure to the extent that on both sides of the house, there are social impositions that are widespread and that are pushed to people to believe what they should believe and what they should not believe, basically. So what did the government say here? They said social determinism has study cases and therefore you can create the good kind of social determination, which is what OG said. 2 things to under this. The first thing is that I don't think Neanderthals had Python or Java to run these algorithms of correctness and incorrectness. This is a debate about a whole new world. And for that reason, I don't think they can fiat out that this is good kind of social determination. Presumably, you can also socially determine that religion is the correct one and therefore people actively believe in that. But secondly, I think the determination of social goods are probably going to be similar on both sides. Columbus might still invade the new world, for instance. Trump might still exist. The point is that particular social standard never gets checked because of moral determinism. 4 extra lines of analysis. Firstly, Proposition upscales social imposition. Like this means individuals like lose out on agency because they believe that that was the current point in time that they had to exist in. But secondly, determination of good and bad. You have no ability to determine morally good institutions over morally bad institutions. The reason why is because every point we are at now is a necessary point to be at right now. So individuals lose out on the conception of good and bad, and they just internalize those kinds of behaviors. But thirdly, even if it's true that our empathy can say killing a person is morally bad in a general sense, moral determinism would say killing an evil person is good, or nationalism is a necessary reason for murder, for instance. The point is that any moral institutions that we have are never accessed, primarily because they are seen as having to be there without any actual reason for having to be there. But fourthly, there's an opt-out mechanism for individuals on our side. On a very individual level, our side allows for individuals in certain cultures or religions to get out at the moment when they think this does not align with what I believe and I empathetically believe, or what I intuitively believe is correct. This proves larger individual successes insofar as people do not operate on a stasis on proposition and instead operates on their own interests and their own desires, basically, right? So that is the mechanism that we give to you. OO explains that you don't get agency because of complacency. I say you don't get agency because of upscaling social impositions, loss of discerning moral outcomes, and even if, and also fourthly, an opt-out mechanism. So the conclusion is this: the only way you get individual benefits is via tapping into your own desires, emotions, and intuitions. You can only do that on our side, as the world on both sides would socially impose ideologies which people cannot discern. On our side, you give that ability to discern the correctness and incorrectness, and for all those reasons, we're going to take the debate.
Thank you, Britain Spiro. Next is Government Web.
Okay, check on my article. Okay, for the POI, please just write it in the chat box because I'm going to be standing by in the chat box. So I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. First of all, I think I want to kick opening opposition out of this debate because I think that it is true, like what my member has told you previously, that when we believe in the concept of free will, for example, it is not enough for you as opposition to simply claim all of the benefit of it, right? Because I think that the benefit is highly contingent on the actual exercise of this free will, for example. I think that the most important thing that opening opposition need to defend if they would like to claim their positive cases, for example, is to tell us how then they are going to mechanize this particular human being and civilization that exist under their sort of the house will eventually exercise the free will, for example, for the importance of the communal society, or and so on and so forth, right? Because I think that what happened under their side of the house is going to be a free will that only think that the one that you think is right to do is the one that is based on the perspective. And we think that this is something that is wrong, because the civilization, you are going to allow the civilization under opening opposition for the house to be dictated. By the majority and so on and so forth, right? So this is something that I'm going to bring to you, right? So first of all, I would like to first engage to opening opposition and suddenly to closing opposition, and along the way this thing opening government in this debate, right? So first of all, opening opposition cases, they talk about free will versus determinism and why free will believe that you can have a choices, for example, and this is something that is good. We say that this is not true because let's restart this word and analyze what kind of civilization will they live in, right? Look, the understanding about determinism does not mean you have no agency at all to change or to get stuck on your look. That is the belief that allow individual to believe that sometimes things happen out of your control and you do not have to be too hard on yourself because of this, because that's the role that the universe told you or assigned you to be. The problem with their civilization in opposition side of the house is that all people believe that the reason why certain individuals are gay or define themselves as a sexual minority, for example, is because of their society believe that this is our choice to begin with, right? I think that the manifestation of harm of this is that you are gaslighting this minority, for example, making them believe that this is their choices and further push them to change their sexuality. Because in your civilization, you believe they can change and ask them to just simply pick and choose the sexual orientation that they wanted, right? I think that the manifestation of harm of this, there will be twofold. Number one, these people under their side of the house will only make the minority group to feel more oppressed and allow them to keep blaming themselves that this is their fault, for example, that maybe it's true that it's their choice. Bilang aja kalau mau POI.
Yeah.
But second, society expectation under opening opposition side of the house is going to be very detrimental. Why is that so? Because when people assume you can pick and choose your sexual orientation, for example, the people under their side of the house will simplify the struggle of these minority individuals, for example, in finding their sexual identity, for instance, right? Because they are just asking you and expect you to simply pick and choose the sexuality, right? Without actually analyzing or even paying attention to the struggles and journey that you have undergone before you find your sexual identity. The problem is that their journey in finding their sexual identity, for example, is probably a very rocky road, right? We think that principally undermining someone's journey are not moral at the end of the day, right? But second of all, they told you that free will make a better life. And we say that this is not true. The first question is that whose life is going to be better under their side of the house, right? I think that the benefit of team opening opposition highly contingent on the belief that people will exercise their free will in a good manner, that humans do not have the nature to be greedy, for example, right? That when people exercising their free will, it is for the best for humanity, for example, like what Aaron do in the very first place. The problem is you cannot disattach human nature to be greedy, for example. OO should explain why this free will suddenly make things better. Because in the civilization under their side of the house, where free will designed the condition of people's life, what most likely happen is that under their side of the house is people having less incentive to those people who are in power, for example, will have less incentives to create policy that might allow poor people exist in the world, because they believe that the reason why poor people exist is not because of the externalities, but it's because poor people are lazy to work and so on, right? Because this is something that they choose to live, for example, condition that they choose to live, for example. Under our side of the house, people will sympathize, ladies and gentlemen, that the reason why you are poor now is not because of your choice. It's because your past family lived in a poor family. People know you are being poor is not something that is not within your control, and this is not the choice that you choose. Therefore, the policy to lift the poor under closing government side of the house might exist because they sympathize to these individuals, as they will be fully aware that they are poor are not because of their choice, ladies and gentlemen, right? I think that this is something that exists under their side of the house. In opening opposition and also closing opposition, ladies and gentlemen, people who are in power, for example, will have massive control, massive feelings of entitlement, for example, that they deserve to do whatever they want to, is because they have been working so hard to achieve this particular position at the end of the day. The reason being is that sometimes they exercise their free will, for example, imposing certain economic policy is always at the cost of minority group, ladies and gentlemen, being disenfranchised out of civilization, right? I think that this is something that is bad, right? This is directly engaged with closing governments as well, right? They tell you that we can control the injustices, for example, and call out institutions and so on and so forth. But let's engage to the best case scenario that has been brought by team closing government, right? Because we think that in their best case scenario, where you can, for example, assume that we can call out this institution, maybe we can, but it does not necessarily help the minorities under their side of the house. That's simply because the one who is more likely, for example, to dictate their civilization, the one who are able to have the platform, for example, to have the voice under their side of the house, are those people who are privileged and those people who are not disenfranchised under their side of the house, right? What is the comparative under our side of the house? At the very least, under our side of the house, maybe you live a horrible life, but at least your life is something that is not the result of other people dictating you, for example, right? This entire civilization that exists under closing governments of the house is not for example, the civilization that only pursue the interests of the majority people, for example, because of these majority people, for example, are the one who is more likely to speak up to the House of Representatives, for example, saying what they want, for example, making the civilization to be controlled based on the interests of this majority people, right? Under our side of the house, maybe in both sides of the house, you live a horrible life. But at the very least, under our side of the house, we live in a horrible life because we know that this is something that is not within our control, not because of other people is able to control the condition of our life, making an economic policy that is too harmful for the poor, and this is something that we do not like under our side of the house, right? So this is the reason why even if in both sides of the house you live a horrible life, at the very least, you believe that this is not your fault, and that is what gives contentment towards individuals under our side of the house, very proud to stand anti-government.
Yeah, Thanks, government web. Last opposition web.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
I'm going to
Yes,
start.
edible.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. If I believe in determinism, I wouldn't be where I am today. By I mean Omarian, not Britney Spears. But in any case, I was born in a family with mountains of debts that I still help pay until this day. In a family where none of my parents were educated, which explains their jobless status and habits of borrowing money. But I am now an aspiring professional who worked my ass off to get a dream job that I've waited for 6 years to get the job, who tried my best to get into my dream university and my dream master degree program. I got here and soon over there because I have faith in what I can do according to my limits. I believe in my free will that I get to choose, do I want to be better or do I want to accept the conditions that I have? Without my faith in myself and my free will, I would have listened to my parents that I should just be mediocre and, just being enough because what matters to them is for me to keep paying their debts. But the key point to that story is the fact that in the either world, desires exist. Then the question is, what do we want to do with our desires? Do we want to act upon it? Or do we want just to let it be desire and no means of at least trying to achieve it because your surroundings convince you it's not worth pursuing? Oo did okay when they talk about self-actualization, becoming a better version of yourselves, yada yada. But that's not the most important part, right? The most important part should be your ability to project your desires into actions. The ability to do that, or the agency, is what makes human human. And this is what my member talk about. The first contribution that I want to highlight as the whip in this team. Because without the push of being the agency of your own desires, you will not want to be better or even actualize. Therefore, this is the most principle in the debate, the most important principle in the debate. All of the individual benefits posited by OO rely on the existence of agency that free will gives you. Thus, we mechanize the process because just by believing in free will does not make you want to fight for your life, like OO said, which also CG questioned, but it's because you believe in the agency of yourself to make a change, a manifestation of the belief in free will that keeps you going. This desire also allows you to escape a society or community that has conceptions that are different from yours. On their side, impositions will still exist, and what you believe in doesn't matter because whatever is being imposed on you should be the way of life which you eventually are forced to be content with. This is the contribution from a member that the government whip conveniently disregarded. In the government's world, they keep changing the definition of what determinism is, which is unfortunate, right? First, they said it's about being happy and being content about things that you cannot control or things like that, or accepting the circumstances you are in, right? Then in opening government, the DPM said that it's about learning from past mistakes, which is quite a tension and definitely a wrong definition. Because if you choose to make a change and make things better, then you believe in your free will that you can change things. If you actively believe in determinism, most likely you won't try to change things because that just goes against your belief that things have been predetermined for you. So leave OG in case judges haven't already. I'm going to address EG in the later part of the debate, right? But anyway, in their world, desires stay as desires. They stay as imagination that you do not have the motivation to achieve it even because you believe if it's yours, then it's yours. Even if you might die peacefully because at the end of your days, you believe then it's not yours, but you're stripped away of the capacity to try, to be the agent of your own desires, and that's not living. Because what happens if no one wants to try? Second contribution, social justice. Individual changes are nice, but the world revolves around a much larger scale, groups, civilizations, and everything else. In a world of injustice, we need people who believe they can make a change, not only for themselves, but also for a greater good. The desire to make the world a better place, not only for you, needs a certain degree of belief in free will because you believe you can engineer a change on a larger scale. Every fight against social injustice rose up from a simple belief that whatever you can do within your capacity can trigger a change. And that's exactly the push behind many initiatives for social justice. The gays in Stonewall Riot in 1960s know that the battle for equality might not be achieved in their lifetime, and it didn't. Even if we fast forward 60 years later, we still fight for our social justice, for an acknowledgement and recognition. But the beautiful thing about believing in free will then is a legacy that you left for future movements. Because the LGBTQ plus groups in the 1960s believed they could make a change, the movements today believe that their actions can make further change. And there's a cycle of advancement that you could create if you believe in your free will and your ability to make a change. In their world, not only that individuals from minority groups will feel even more disgusted with themselves because their identities go against the predetermined values of the society they live in, there would be no way for them to make a change because they believe their circumstances at that point are the circumstances they should be in. There will be no one to kickstart a radical movement that can benefit the society as a whole. So responding to closing government, when they said that we can base off our morality or things like that, that's exactly where it's bad, because the current dominant narrative will decide the course of the society. People who do not conform will not speak up because their existence is wrong to begin with. And I do not need people telling me that my existence is wrong. So only in our world do you get people to fight for social justice, for things that otherwise in their world would have been shunned away or shut down because what they are not in line with the preconceived notions that people believe in that capacity. Undermining movements like what the government web posited will exist on both sides, as if right now we have a lot of people fighting for their rights, but even then a lot of people are still undermining them. We're not going to deny that, but that doesn't matter. What matters is, do you want to keep marching forward if you are being undermined? On their side, being undermined will keep you stuck in a shell, because that shell is the determinism that you believe in, that you are just minority, so you have to succumb to a larger power that defines the determinism that you should believe in. Then they talk about building empathy and whatnot, right? Sure, it might be true, but that's it. What's the point of doing more than just empathizing? Because you already accept that is exactly what's happening on you and on other people, right? So because that's exactly what these lives should be. If anything, it's going to expand the disparity even more, because now everyone believes that they are in each circumstance exactly because it's been predetermined for them. The poor will not be fighting because they are content with their life, for example. The rich are comfortable. Everyone else admits that they have no control, including their actions. So then there's no change whatsoever, or even the attempt to make a change. It won't be what CG said as well, that people think that they are who they are, so they're going to fight for their rights. But this predetermined conception of themselves will be overshadowed by a concept that is more accepted by the larger society or the majority. The poor do have the agency, pushing for more equitable policies and everything else, which have garnered support not only from the poor but also from the working and middle classes. Heck, even our ancestors fought colonizers with freaking sharp bamboos because we don't have the arms and weaponries. In their world, people will not even think about that because it's pointless, they say. So what kickstarted the fight is the belief that desire can be acted upon. That's why my members talk about religion, as most likely who defines determinism would be religious institutions, and their absence is a net benefit that would be important for the world to envision. Sure, not all battles can be won, and not actions of free will are within your capacity. But the most important part, you try. If you fail once, then you try other things. That's just the nature of human beings. BLM, for example, started off as a very grassroots movement, but the change did not accumulate, so they march on the streets. Trial and error can only exist in a world in which you have the desire to change things. So even if you want to do something, you will stick with what you know because you believe that that's the means that you should focus on, making you stuck on repeat, and that's exactly the world we want to avoid. Vote for closing opposition.
So thank you for the debate. I think before I go into the decisions and also the reasoning behind my decisions, I have like one general comments. I feel like although that you guys are operating on like one same class, which is about like which one that can create like social changes or like can create betterment of like individual or like the communities. I feel like it's and that was like a good like engaging debate in of itself. One thing that I quite noticed though is I think there is a slight misinterpreting the emotions and how you can like operate your arguments and in engagement based on the wording of the motion in of itself. Because like I believe that this motion was talking about like actively believe in determinisms, not like fully believe in determinism, right? So I feel like there was a slight like I imagine like the motions would say that, oh, people like in government side, for example, are believing in determinisms. They access they understand the existence of free will. It's just like it's a really really small factor in how people do their decision making, or people like their behavior in of it and how it affects people's behavior in of itself. So these characterizations of the motion is quite important in engaging some of the like arguments coming from like each other team. Like I like just for example, okay, I forgot, but like yeah, basically is that I feel like well, the motions could have been interpreted better in that way, you know, in um in making debate much more better engaging and less like deadlocky kind of way, you know. So yeah, I feel like that is a quite important general comments that I would like to input. So into the decisions, I give the winning to the closing bands. So the first goes to closing opposition, second to closing governments, third to opening oppositions, and fourth goes to opening government. So the each team like each rank is quite clear. Although in closing bands it was quite close to clear. So the reasons of why I give the winning to closing bands is because I feel like in closing bands there was a much more grounded on the characterizations and painting of the world in of itself, how it affects individual in a more practical way, and like the and how and how it affects every layer of the world. Like for example, in CG they talk about how it affects the sexual minority, how it affects government's policy. For example, in CO, they're talking about how it also affects like sexual minorities. It affects how people like engage to religion, for example, how it affects like how they getting out of their own comfortable zone and create betterment of themselves, which I feel like it's quite absent in opening governments and opening oppositions or like opening beds in general. Like I don't get for example why then like contentment is something that exists in OG is something that's actually like quite important in a world in the world in of itself. Secondly is like what kind of contentment that you want, like for example first if you're talking about like contentment community that is full of contentment, like how it is actually like in the like definitely better, it is definitely a better world, for example. Or like if you're talking about like individual feeling overwhelmed, what kind of like overwhelm that you are talking about in a more like picture painting kind of way, in oppositions, in opening oppositions we're talking about on how like people have more responsibility to do bad things because they like uh, have like responsibility to choose their actions, how it create individual betterment, how it like affects choices, how it incentivizes them to like make choices to create better create better like better situation. For example, in opening oppositions is quite unclear of like what kind of like betterment that you're talking about. I feel like in a principle in a principle ground of analysis, I think opening opposition was quite clear. I kind of not understand of like what is the manifestations of that principle that you are trying to establish. Like if you want to create a like betterment of yourself, what kind of betterment that you want? So I feel like that mechanization analysis and the picture of the world and how it is better rather than the counterfactual closing bands is it's more contributive rather than opening bands. So let's talk about opening governments and why they cannot beat OO. So opening governments brought about three things, or two things. Number one, on how like individual like feeling overwhelmed with choices in the world of free will. Secondly is the like they have incentive to responsibility to create changes because they themselves will determine the future individuals conditions, right? I feel like that's the best that's the best versions of that argument that I imagine coming from opening governments. On the first argument they also like create manifestation of the like benefit, like talking about like in the set how they will feel contentment and it's going to create better quality of life. So in isolation of the argument, before I go comparing to OO, there is quite questionable analysis in opening governments. Number one, like if we're talking about the contentment, like to what extent the harm of absence of contentment in yourself the house will going to manifest toward this individual. Secondly, of why like the idea of contentment is something that's actually important for the individual to like weight their decisions of which one is a better world. So I feel like the framing on that benefit, even though that it is beneficial, even though it's important, obviously in potential, even though it is potential, why then like this is something that is actually um important for me to like um for me to decide that OG is better than all other team. So I feel like that framing is really important to actually like make the weight of that argument much more bigger. Secondly, is that I feel like it's quite tension on their own argument. I feel like the idea of contentment that individual will receive in your side of the house, and then in your same argument, in your same speech, you're talking about on how like this will going to incentivize themselves to create changes. I feel like the idea of contentment and the concept of create changes in of itself was quite self-defeating because in my mind when I hear the argument, I cannot I cannot uh, understands the logic of why when individuals feel contentment, they will have the incentive to create changes, right? So I feel like there need to be a more deep layer analysis of why this like this each benefit is not self-defeating, like that it works in different dimension. So without that analysis, I feel like the two benefit that opening governments wants to propose was quite self-defeating, and it's quite hard for me to like buy and be persuaded from your argument of why OG wins other teams. But against OO, right? Let's just compare with OO. So why then OO wins over OG was three things. Number one, I feel like the feasibility to create changes that opening governments wants to propose is more there. Like DLO talking about on how like people were going to in world in determinism, people are going to be trapped in flow of fate, and you cannot do changes because like changes is something that is actually beyond your capability and it is beyond your control. For example, like the whole situation is beyond your control and you don't have like the bargaining power to actually create changes in of itself. So in that sense, I feel like this defeats OG because in OG I don't see the analysis of how exactly like okay, so you have responsibility to create changes to determine your future version to future individual, but then why then you can have the capability to create changes when the concept of determinism exists in your side of the house. I feel like that analysis was absent, and therefore the opposition's argument in that regard on how like you don't have the capability or like the capacity to create changes, it's much more palatable. Secondly is about like the idea of individual, oh sorry, the idea of individual feeling overwhelmed in government side of the house. I feel like it's already being pointed out in opening oppositions that there will be zero delta in government side of the house because on how like people will going to be feel also overwhelmed in your side of the house because um like the whole like you when you comprehend your whole conditions, you cannot comprehend the because like it goes beyond your environment, like your closest environment. You also need to comprehend of like how like the mystery of the universe impacting your condition, for example, that is exists in DLO. I feel like it defeats the premise of opening governments harm of free will makes you feel overwhelmed, because like the idea of determinism also makes you overwhelmed because of the like unknown factor that's going to affect in your life. So lastly is on the individual betterment, right? So I feel like the idea of liberation of control that exists in OO, it's much more palatable than contentment. Like opening oppositions brought the idea on how like in their side of the house, people can actualize themselves, and therefore they become more liberated because they have like certain degree of control. I feel like it's much more palatable because it's quite um it's quite important for this individual. Like it's quite contingent to each individual's what they want, and therefore I don't see of why like this cannot go over the idea of like contentment, right? Because like why contentment is something that is actually that important, especially when oppositions brought the idea that you cannot be content when you are like suffering in your side of the house, and how you can like make the best out of that suffering. I feel like on that idea, the idea of liberation is much more important rather than contentment. Yeah, if you get what I mean. So that's why I feel like in that three analysis, you OG is over OO is over OG. So let's talk about like CO over CG. Yeah. So I feel like in idea of um, calling out the system and calling out injustice is quite deadlocked, unfortunately, in closing debate, because closing governments brought on the idea that like, oh, in the idea of determinisms, it means that it is not you that are contributing toward like the your conditions, that you can blame it on problematic systems, and in there's a in opposition side of the house, you can blame it on the individual agency to make choices. In closing oppositions, you talk about on how like there is no justification in imprisoning people, because like you're going to like this is this is just who you are. Like your whole condition is just imposing upon yourself, and you cannot do changes upon that. So um so that's why like in free will, you can like call out people because those people are the one who cause that conditions, right? So in that sense, I feel like the premise is quite the same. On like in closing governments with determinism, you can blame it on problematic system, but in closing oppositions, you can also blame it on the problematic systems, because like those problematic systems are the one that have the choices to impose that conditions upon those disenfranchised people, right? So I feel like the prerequisites of calling out people is like have the same degree of analysis in closing bands. I don't get what the exclusivity of each bench. So the way I weight the both benches is on the worst case of how, what if you cannot call out, right? Because like I feel like that thing is something that's actually not quite discussed in the debate in of itself. So the reasons of why then in that framing, CO beats over CG is about, I feel like CO is much more palatable in picturing of why then the harm toward individual, regardless of you can create changes or not, it's much more magnified in CG because you internalize your conditions. For example, in CO, you're talking about on how like people that are homosexual, for example, they internalize this condition as they need to suffer in that condition, or like people who are trapped in religion, they're going to be trapped. It's either like they are determined, they are like being chosen in that conditions against their will, or when they get out, they will going to be punished to hell, for example, even in web opposition web, they're talking about on how like they are going to be suffered in mediocrity rather than the capability to like fight to create changes upon themselves. So I feel like in that regard, like those harm about internalizing the suffering, it is not contingent upon CG's or it's not contingent upon CG's arguments, which is mainly talking about on how you can create changes in of itself. Secondly, it's because like I feel like in CG's case, like talking about like you can blame it on problematic systems and whatnot. I feel like it's quite contingent upon like those idea will go like the changes will manifest that, otherwise the benefit will not going to matter us at all in CG, right? Because so therefore like the prerequisite of you to create changes need to exist in CG. So I feel like in that sense, like CO's argument that is much more independent rather than CG's argument that is really contingent upon the benefit is materialized, it's much more palatable in that regard. Secondly, second argument of like just to make it clear of why CG cannot win over CO in terms of engagement. So CG, although that have attempt in like making it like charitable in rebuttal of the calling out, like in Randy that he's talking like they are he or they talking about like how in their side of the house, like the idea of policy changes and whatnot, I feel like it's quite the rebuttal is quite confusing. Like the whole rebuttal is about like evil system creating harm to the disenfranchised and making like free choice and the choices that are imposed toward themselves. But then the contentment that you are talking about, like the what's called like the breaking up the deadlock part that exists in that rebuttal was on the idea on like only exists in those people feeling content, right? So I don't get the idea of why then people feeling content will make changes upon like those people create create like free choices upon those free will, create those kind of like harmful policies upon those individuals. So I feel like the rebuttal, even though the attempt was like really commendable, it's quite working on two different dimension. I don't get of why then like your rebuttal upon CEO was can actually like fly. So I feel like in that sense, I feel like the whip attempt, whip is successfully like throwing OO under CG, but cannot throw CO over CG. So yeah, in that regards, that's why CG cannot go over CO. Yeah, that's my education. Sorry if it is messy. But if you want to have like any kind of feedback, or you want to like give me just feedback, please approach me in WhatsApp. Or you can also approach my other panel. He's also quite good. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.